I'm Jen Dool. I'm the Young Adult Coordinator with Richmond Public Library, and I'm joined tonight by Rose Szabo, the author of What Big Teeth. Welcome. And tonight, Rose is going to be doing a reading of her book and then some Q&A at the end. And if you all have questions that come up throughout the reading, feel free to type them in using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. But you can also feel free to chat with each other in the chat panel as well. But the Q&A option will help me kind of keep track of what questions you have. So again, welcome to local author Rose Szabo. Their book just came out last week, right? So it's only been really a week that it debuted.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Congratulations. And Rose is actually super local. You live in Richmond, and you and currently teach at VCU, is that correct?
Yes.
Awesome. And so where are you a native from, Rose, just out of curiosity?
Not too far. I'm from Northern Virginia, but I've lived in Richmond off and on since I was like 17. So at this point, this really feels like home.
Oh, good. So we can claim you then. That's great.
Please.
We love that. We love being able to claim really amazing authors in Richmond, especially YA authors. I personally love to be able to do that. So that's great. Well, I have read Rose's book and just absolutely loved it. So I'm excited to hopefully get some of you all turned on to it this evening. But first, Rose, if you don't mind, before we get started with the reading, would you give us sort of a little synopsis of the story, because it's so unique?
Sure. So this is a book about a girl named Eleanor who's been away from her family at boarding school for several years, not necessarily by her choice. And after basically like a very upsetting fight with another student, she flees back to her home in coastal Maine and reunites with her family, only to discover / remember that they're werewolves. And so it's a book partially about werewolves, but it's also a book about trying to find your place as a young person in your family, outside of your family, trying to figure out what parts of the life that you know you want to accept and what parts you want to reject.
Yeah, that's something that really stood out to me. It's amazing how similar a family of monsters can be to just your normal everyday family too. Kind of the same troubles, the same obstacles, the same sort of relationships, and all of that good stuff that goes along with family, good and bad. So that was really cool. Well, what part of the story are you going to be reading with us today?
I'm going to start all the way at the beginning. I'll start with the prologue and do a bit of chapter 1. I feel like that gives you a pretty good feel for the book. And, that way, if you decide to read it, you've already read the first chapter, I suppose.
Perfect. All right, and then because everybody comments on how beautiful the cover is too, I'm going to go ahead and share that on my screen so you get a view of that as well. All right, can you all see that?
I can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rose.
All right, are you ready?
Yeah, I can't wait.
All right, What Big Teeth? Prologue. Somewhere in the night forest, the boy is running. I cannot smell him like my sister Luma and our cousin Reese can, his sweat and his fear, but I can hear him, as well as the creak of branches, the rustle of the leaves that stir underfoot. He's moving from the birch stands onto the pine needles. I can hear the pounding of his blood, the frustrated sob as he tries to keep his legs on the unfamiliar ground. Our other cousin, Charlie, is here too, clattering through the stream bed below on new shoes. He's clumsy and young, but he has other talents. So do Reese and Luma, who changed as soon as we left the house and now run on all fours, so silent that even my ears can't pick them up. I left my shoes on the porch, and my bare feet are whispers on the pine needles, but I'm sure that they can hear my heart beating with wild excitement. It's spring dusk. A thin crescent moon slices upward through the sky. The boy bursts out into a clearing full of tall grass and the burrows of small animals. This is the choke point. The boy puts his foot in a rabbit hole and falls. I glance past him, across the clearing, until I spot a pair of luminescent eyes. Reese tilts his head up and rumbles. Now. We all converge at once. Reese from the right, me from the left, and Luma pounces from behind with both forepaws. The boy goes sprawling onto his stomach under her weight, rolling as we let him get up, scrabbling through the wet grass and trying to get his feet under him again. Charlie stumbles out of the dark and plants his hands on his knees, wheezing a little. The boy crawls for Charlie. He is saying, "Run," and then he looks at us and notices that Charlie is showing no fear. He begs him for help. Reese and Luma nip at the boy's ankles while I climb onto his back, riding him as they drag him backward into the dark. The boy is still yelling at our cousin. Charlie finally gets a breath into his lungs, straightens up. He pushes his glasses up his nose and trots along after us as we recede toward the tree line. "Don't you all ever get tired of this?" Charlie asks us while the boy cries for us to let him go. "Don't you want to play something else?" Reese lets go of the boy's ankle for a moment, cocks his head up at Charlie, panting, grinning now from a human face. "No," he says. We drag the boy back into the shadow of one of the big pine trees. Someone's yelling for us back at the house. It sounds like the visiting banker has realized his son is missing. "What should we do with him?" Reese says. "Boil him up into soup," says Luma. She hates soup, but the joke is lost on the boy, who sobs harder. Charlie is restless, looking around. "I'm going to make him forget. We'll get in trouble if we don't." "Wait." I hold up a hand. I feel something that's new, some hungry little hollow place inside me. I think I want to eat him." Reese slaps me on the back and Luma squeals with delight. I've never wanted to eat anybody before, and they're proud. You can't, though," Reese says quickly. "We promised Grandma," says Luma. "All right." I plant my hands on the boy's shoulders and start to climb down off of him. As I do, my mouth stretches wide like a yawn, although I don't feel tired. "Let's go." And then something happens that I do not understand. I'm sitting on the pine needles. My jaw aches unbearably, and the boy is gone. Chapter 1. I opened my eyes, and I was on the train. I was the only passenger left. How long had I been asleep? I looked down to make sure I still had my things, my straw hat, my suitcase stamped with the letter Z. I'd hung onto them this whole way, through sleeping on a bench in Penn Station and sprinting to catch a train in Boston, ever since I'd left St. Bridget's School for Young Ladies this time yesterday. Thinking about it, I ran my tongue over my teeth again. No matter how many times I did it, I could still taste copper. The door at the far end of the car clattered open, and I jumped. With just the conductor, coming down the aisle to check on me. He looked nervously down at me, and I felt guilty, wondering if he could tell I was on the run. "You the stop in Winterport?" he asked. I nodded. His eyes had wandered down to my suitcase. "You got people there," he said. "I'm kin of the Hannafins myself." People up here were like this, I remembered suddenly, always wanting to know about your family. "The Zarrins," I offered. He twitched like a rabbit before settling himself back down. "I thought you might be," he said. "They don't leave Winterport much, do they?" "I did," I said. "I haven't been back in 8 years." Once I said it, I froze, terrified he'd ask me why I was coming back now. I rummaged frantically in my mind for a convincing lie, but he just smiled at me tightly and touched his hat. "We'll just be slowing down, not a full stop," he said. "Don't worry, people do it all the time. When the whistle blows the first time, get ready." He disappeared, and I stared out the window and watched the landscape for a while. It had been almost summer in Maryland, but as we rumbled across the bridge that divides New Hampshire from Maine, I saw a few stubborn patches of snow clinging on beneath the pine trees. I'd been angry when I'd got on the train, and that had kept me in motion, but the weather chilled my anger and crystallized it into fear. Maybe there were good reasons I wasn't supposed to be at home. I had a vague, half-remembered feeling that it wasn't exactly safe. It felt faded and vaguely ridiculous. None of it seemed plausible when I held it up to the light. But if it was true, if I was right, then I needed to be home again. After all, there was no other place for me in the world, not after what I'd done. Lucy Spencer flashed in my mind for a moment then, her red hair coming out of its braid, her face twisted in that expression people make right before they start screaming. And then the whistle was blowing. Get ready, he'd said. I hefted my suitcase, clapped my hat on my head. Time to go visit my family. The conductor came back to open the door for me as the train slowed. He couldn't even look me in the eye. He mumbled something that sounded like, be careful. And then we were rumbling slowly past a platform, and I was stepping out into the air. I felt a jarring, sickening sensation of the world rising up to meet me. I staggered, let go of the suitcase, and hit one knee on the wood of the platform, the train still trundling behind me. I crawled away from it, feeling like I'd been in an accident. It was moving faster than I thought when I was on it. I told myself not to be weak. I made sure I hadn't scraped my knee. I didn't want anyone around here to see my blood. I got to my feet, checked to make sure my suitcase hadn't popped open in the fall, and took a moment to get my bearings. The platform was deserted. Beyond it, the single cobbled street of the town bent like an elbow out into the ocean, with houses lining the crook. Along the water were docks where fishing boats bobbed up and down at their moorings. The sun was going down behind the tree-covered hills, bathing the town in alternating stripes of red light and shadow. 3 young boys knelt in the street, their hand-me-down coats straining threadbare over their backs. I found myself watching them closely, my eyes locked on them. They were using a stick to try and loosen one of the cobblestones. One of them looked up and saw me and froze. I watched him reach down, as though he thought if he moved slowly enough, I wouldn't see him. His dirty fingers scrabbled at the edges of the stone until he held it in his hand. I saw his fingers clamp shut around it, and I saw the muscles in his shoulder begin to tense. I tensed too, sinking down lower, ready to duck or run forward. It was like he knew me, like he knew what I'd done. You there! An old man hobbled out of a store, waving a walking stick. The boys scattered, tearing off across the cobbles. I shuddered like someone being woken up from a dream. The man brandished the stick half-heartedly after the boys, but it seemed as though he'd already forgotten them as he turned to look up at me on the platform, shielding his eyes to see me more clearly. I clambered down to meet him. He was bent at the shoulder, his blue eyes cloudy with age, and he wore a clerical collar. Ah, young Eleanor, he said. I'm sorry, I said. I don't think I know you. Father Thomas, he said. Your grandmother didn't want to introduce you to me until you were older. He had the same sharp staccato accent as the man on the train. But I know about all of you. He winked. I blushed, not quite knowing why, wondering what exactly it was that he knew. Well, thank you for chasing them off. My job, pastor of St. Anthony in Winterport, here to help the lost. He chuckled a little to himself. You need directions up to the house. I think I remember. Who were they? Oh, them? Kids from town, he said. They don't understand you're safe enough. I suppose there's something instinctual makes them want to throw rocks at Zarrins. His matter-of-factness chilled me, but I'd known my family was dangerous, so why was I surprised that other people knew it too? I don't think they're expecting me, I said. Will that be a problem? The Zarrins have never much liked unexpected company, he said, but they are expecting you. Your grandma sent Margaret down this morning with a note, asked me to greet you. I hadn't seen that coming. I'll walk you as far as the church, he said. He offered to take my suitcase, but I said I'd manage. He hitched along behind me, leaning on his cane. The whole way I thought I spotted people watching us. A twitch of lace curtains at a window, a rustle as though someone had just ducked behind a hedge. It was almost funny. But then when we got up to the weathered clapboard church, and he went away up the path and in through the door, nothing about it seemed funny anymore. I was alone. At the edge of the road, at the edge of town, the road went nearly straight up a steep incline into a copse of silver birch. The climb was hard. My suitcase banged against my already bruised leg, and I started carrying it in my arms. The wind curled through the trees, blowing through my uniform until I couldn't stop shivering. A car crawled along behind me for a while, but then passed me at a crest where the road widened. At school, cars would honk at us when we walked in groups. Boys would lean out and ask us if we wanted to ride, and the nuns would yell at them to leave us alone. Not here. I wondered if the driver recognized me, or just the direction I was walking. I came to a place where the road forked. To the right, it became a bridge that spanned a narrow sound and traveled onward up the coast. To the left, a dirt road that darted directly up the steep slope into the deep woods. Trees made a tunnel overhead. It was beautiful up there in the darkening forest, but I sensed that it was not a place to be caught alone at night. I bent my knees and adjusted my gait to move silently, then crept forward. Birds sang here, and wild creatures rustled in the bushes. My ear pricked at the small sounds. Geography settled into place around me. To my right, down the tree-lined slope, a stream bed that carried a torrent of meltwater every spring, eventually pouring off a cliff into the sea. And a little to one side of that, there was a line in the woods where it transitioned from birch to aspen. And a little farther up the path, visible in glimpses as I climbed steadily, was the front lawn. I rounded a bend, and the trees fell away, and all that remained was the house. It loomed over the landscape, towers and porches and balconies and bay windows, story after story of decorative gingerbreading, crown molding, sunburst emblems, recessed niches, and high gables, and all of it covered in gray scalloped shingles like scales, and at the very top of the highest tower, the creaking weather vane in the shape of a running rabbit. It was hard to look at. Not all of it fit into my view at once, even after I took a few steps back. I realized that now it scared me. It was too much. It felt oppressive, a giant squatting at the top of the world. I stared the house down, willing it to blink its windows first, and then I took a couple quick steps across the narrow band of lawn, planted my foot deliberately on the first step, and launched myself up to the door. It was black, not painted, black wood with twisted carvings and a brass horse head with a ring clenched in its teeth. I lifted the ring and let it fall. No answer for a long moment. Behind me, the wind ran up my spine and made me shiver. I reached for the knob and threw the door open. A moan filled the air. A window opened somewhere that pulled the air from the door through the house, turning the front hall into a throat. As I stepped forward into the house, suction yanked the door shut behind me, and the sound of the ocean sloughing off the cliffs at the far side of the house faded to a whisper. Other than that, there was no sound, except for somewhere down the hall, a heavy clock ticking. I looked around with my heart pumping, my hands locked around my suitcase. The entry hall soared 2.5 stories, ceiling lost in darkness somewhere overhead, the rails of the second floor lined with unlit post lamps. The central staircase snaked down in 2 streams from the upper floors, joining in the middle and furling out into the front hall, covered in carpet the faded red of a tongue. The wainscot gleamed, but the baseboards were scratched and scarred, and the wallpaper, printed with scenes of men hunting stags, lay tattered in places. An age-spotted mirror stood propped up against a narrow hall table that also held a cut glass dish of desiccated peppermints. The walls were lined with portraits of dim figures, paintings of sprawling landscapes, lovingly rendered still lifes of animal haunches and goblets overflowing with wine. Things I remembered but didn't recognize, like I'd seen them in a movie or a dream. I felt suddenly dizzy. I wanted to sit down, but what should I sit on? The chair carved in the shape of a grinning devil? A long bench lined with a dozen briefcases with deep gouges in the leather? A pile of twine-covered packages all stamped with fragile and a picture of a skull? Maybe I should just keep moving forward. There were the stairs. Somewhere 2 stories up was my childhood bedroom, and maybe if I could make it in there, shut the door, I would be transformed back into someone who belonged here. But that seemed a long way to go on legs that were longing to carry me down to the floor, or ideally back to town, to the train, to safety. But there was no train. I couldn't leave now, I told myself. Where would I even go?
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to be read to as an adult even. And that was fabulous.
Thank you.
I I just, as someone who has now read the whole book, I have to say the first prologue and the first chapter, just for me, really set the tone for the whole entire story. You do such a great job of not only describing the setting, but just giving sort of this eerie feel. It just literally puts tingles on your spine as a reader. And I would say that those did not go away the whole time I read the book. So I hope that those of you listening got to experience that too. All right. So we're going to open up, now that we've had that lovely reading and intro into What Big Teeth, we're going to open it up for Q&A to the audience. But while we're waiting for people to join in on that, I have a few questions for you, Rose, if you don't mind, to get us started.
Sure.
So I alluded to this in the beginning, and I'm sure that, if for those of you that listen to this first little bit of a reading, this book is like nothing I've ever read before. It is creepy and creative and it completely out of the box, in my opinion. And it starts from chapter 1, and it even gets more so at the end of the book. What inspired you? Was there a certain experience that sort of was the impetus for this story, or did it just come to you in a dream? How did you come about the premise?
So I think part of this is obviously I have a deep and abiding love of the Addams Family.
Okay.
And I started trying to think about like what would be like different about that if it were not sort of already resolved. Like the Addams Family, they're very happy. And I'm always sort of like suspicious of happy family stories, even if I really love them. And so I was like, what would a realistic family of this kind be like? And the other major inspiration is, so my family has a very like macabre and funny storytelling style that's just sort of endemic to us. An example that I use sometimes is, so this is a really terrible thing that happened. I have a great aunt who killed her husband because he was abusive. And that's terrible. But the way that we tell this story is like as though it's very funny. Like, we really build her up as like this sort of dramatic heroine, and we talk about like, like how little jail time she served, and how, the story takes on this life of its own, where we're talking about, and to this day, she keeps a little picture of him in her wallet.
Wow.
And so I can't take entire credit for this. My family taught me how to tell grim, dark stories and to try and make them funny and exciting. And that's what I was trying to do here.
Yeah, and you definitely accomplished that. There's sort of this fight between those two feelings as you're reading the story, which to me makes it that much more disturbing, for sure. We have a question here from Susan. What made you decide your book was a YA book, or did the book just come to you and the YA designation followed?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I feel like I wasn't necessarily intending it to be exclusively for a YA audience, but also it seemed very natural to me that it would fit within YA. It's got a teenage protagonist. She's dealing with a lot of the things that teenagers and young adults are often dealing with. I mean, not exactly, but close enough. Like trying to figure out like whether she trusts her parents' view of the world or whether she wants to make her own. And honestly, like young adult readers are just one of the most thriving and inquisitive audiences. They read a lot. They love books and are sharply critical of them. And so I was like, what a beautiful home for this story to have. I ended up shaping it to be more YA once me and my agent sort of decided that was the direction that we wanted to go in. And I'm really pleased with that decision.
Yeah, as a teen librarian and someone who works with teens, I can certainly see the appeal to that age group. But I think that reading it it would appeal to adults too, for sure. I would encourage adults not to be deterred by the YA designation, because I think that it kind of transcends that as well. Great question. So kind of getting back to the setting a little bit, I know that you studied in Maine for your undergraduate.
Mhm.
Did you work on this story at all while you were there, or did you go back to Maine to sort of revisit and inspire the book?
So that was actually my first master's program, which I did from like 2012 to 2014. And I
Okay.
started writing this book basically like right after I'd left. It had been like a very formative experience because I'd mostly lived in the South and had spent like most of like sort of my early adulthood in Richmond. And then Maine just had like a radically different culture. It felt very isolated in this sort of Gothic way. Um, the weather was really forbidding in this way that made like minor decisions like, am I going to go to the grocery store today, feel life and death. And so I think, you know, I came back to Virginia and I was immediately like nostalgic for it in this weird way of how intense everything had felt while I was there. And so I started writing this book right around that time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, or did you experience any haunted houses while you were there, or have you experienced any in life that sort of inspired this?
No, although Maine has a really weird architectural quirk where for a long time, outbuildings on a piece of property were taxed separately. And so the way that they would build a house would be you would start with a fairly small house, and then you would add an addition, and then another addition, and then an attached shed, and then you would take it up another story. And so the houses became these like sort of like hulking monster houses. And I loved that. And I found those very inspiring.
Yeah, I can imagine those would be very unique in character inside. Well,
Mhm.
speaking of monsters, that, as you know, as I'm sure that you can tell from the reading, there are several monsters. Werewolves are not the only ones in this story. Some you kind of don't really find out what kind of monster these, characters are right at the beginning. Um, do you have a favorite type of monster that you like to write about, or from this story, or have been inspired from?
Mm. Um, I feel like I'm very fond of monsters that don't fit neatly into one particular category. Or I think undead in general are very appealing to me. I think there's something really fascinating about the idea of I don't know, being like so stubborn or persistent that you continue to live after death, or having something that you need to resolve. And also sort of like the tension between the body and the spirit that comes into play when you're thinking about the undead. I have a soft spot for vampires. I love vampire literature, but I'm like very afraid to write vampires because I feel like so much has already been said.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And I can see how you sort of took the traditional werewolf story and kind of shaped it and made it your own for this as well too, which was really unique.
Yeah, I was drawing on some historic werewolf lore, which closely associates werewolves and witches. Um, and so part of this was like me wanting to sort of go back to what were werewolves before werewolf movies existed, and thinking about like how did people write about them and talk about them back then.
Hmm. Hmm. We have another question here from Barbara. She asked, how has being in a pandemic influenced or not your writing?
Oof. Um, so it's been very hit or miss. I feel like in the pandemic there have been like right when the pandemic was starting, I think I was the most productive that I have been in a long time. I think because I was escaping into this fictional world that I was working on at the time, and it gave me a place where nothing was currently going wrong. Um, and it's been up and down since the months have turned into years. I feel like I'm trying to be very patient with myself because, this is not something that anybody could have predicted. And I hope that other writers are also being patient with themselves right now because these are pretty bad working conditions.
Yeah, and every day is different as far as how individuals respond to what's going on. You just kind of never know how you're going to wake up and feel that day. I can totally relate.
Yeah, I mean, now I'm at the point where I'm trying to write like 2 or 3 days a week, and I have that specific day, and I do it first thing in the morning, like cup of coffee and, the computer. And then, yeah, I think Barbara, that's a really great way to put it. We're all just trying to be gracious with each other and with ourselves as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, that's important to remember. So, out of curiosity, you wrote this book pre-pandemic, of course. Was
Mhm.
How long did it take you to write? Was this sort of something that you've worked on over years, or was this something that came together very quickly for you?
Okay, so there was a period of intense productivity on this book, and on either side of that, like years of gestation. So first, I had like a little drawing that I did, like a little doodle that I did of a bunch of characters in a sort of Edward Gorey style, like a family portrait. And then I just looked at that for several years, and I was like, is this like a card game? Is this a board game? Is this uh, like a series of interconnected short vignettes? Is this like a postcard that I'm going to just mail to a friend? Like, I didn't know what it was going to be. And then I got really frustrated sort of trying out all these different possibilities that were fun for a while until I realized none of them were actually going anywhere. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to sit down and write as complete of a draft of a book as I can. And I did that in about 24 hours.
Wow.
Um, but that is not this manuscript. Like this represents like years of work on that draft, which I would be like embarrassed to show anybody now because it's just a wreck. It's what you would write if you were extremely caffeinated and not getting a lot of sleep. So after that, I probably spent like 6 years between writing that draft and the final version that I've got in my hand now.
Wow. Wow.
And a lot of that was the work of other people who were very generous with me and said, "This isn't ready yet. Please try again." And I'm really appreciative of everybody who was willing to say, "No, there's something cool here, but it's not done."
Right.
So I always want to be done.
Yeah. I mean, that's a long process for sure.
Hmm.
So I can understand that. You mentioned that it sort of over time got shaped to be consciously a YA novel versus an adult novel. Um,
Hmm.
I have a question about the genre. Would you be able to classify it as a certain genre? I would have a hard time doing that. I feel like it's kind of a mixture of things.
Well, according to Amazon, I am teen and young adult magical realism fiction and teen and young adult zombie fiction. So one or the other of those, apparently.
That's really interesting because neither
Yeah,
of
I mean,
those would be.
right. I mean, at first I was like, magical realism, really? But then I think maybe part of why it's been classified that way is because certain magical happenings are presented in this very like downplayed, matter-of-fact kind of way that might be reminiscent of that style. Magic is sort of taken for granted rather than always being explicitly introduced. So I can kind of see it.
Mhm. I mean, to me, the one of the main genres that sticks out is, horror and suspense and all of that. But it,
Mhm.
it really bends. There's different aspects to it throughout the story. It doesn't really fit neatly into one box, which is, I think, what makes it very cool at the same time.
Mhm.
Do you have any writers or creators, because I know that you are creative in more than one medium. I know that you know, as you mentioned, you've written essays. It sounds like you draw as well, maybe. And I know that you are very big into fashion. Do you have any creators out there that really inspire you?
Um, the one that I always think of when people ask that is Jordan Peele. Um, I My editor on the first phone conversation that we had, she was just like, "Do you like Jordan Peele movies?" And I was like, "Yes, let's talk about that instead." Um, I was I really appreciated like the way that he's redefined the horror genre around his own interests and desires. And I feel like Us really shook me up because it was I hadn't seen a horror movie in a long time that was so impressionistic and so about like creating these evocative images and feelings and like that focused so deeply on the psychology of the main character over like what was happening in the external world. I was just really moved by it, and like all the cinematography was so perfect. And if I could create something half as good as that, I would be well pleased with myself. So I think about him a lot. Um, I also feel like not a lot of people talk about Ray Bradbury, specifically Ray Bradbury's horror writing rather than like his sci-fi, and that was huge for me. Um, like reading his book From the Dust Returned, I think very heavily influenced my subconscious and the things that I, eventually grew up to write.
Yeah. Both big fan of both of them. But as far as Jordan Peele's work, he has a lot of really big, sort of, well, big, but also subtle social commentary sort of throughout his films. Were there any really big things that you were trying to target in this book? Trying to
Mm.
make a comment on sort of the greater world?
Yeah. So I originally thought about this book as like about the contrast between physical violence and emotional abuse, and
Mhm.
how physical violence is more visible and sort of easier to perceive, but that emotional abuse can be deeply insidious, at least partially because it's much easier to deny what's going on. And as I started writing it, one of the things that I really wasn't expecting to come out of it was the way that all of these characters are sort of defined by these intergenerational traumas. And that was a thread that I didn't notice probably until like the third or fourth or eighth draft. Um, that whenever I was writing about a character acting out or mistreating somebody else, that it always sort of came down to what their previous experiences had been and how they were shaped by them. Like Eleanor's grandfather is sometimes almost a feral creature, and he's very triggered by particular noises or particular reminders of his childhood. And it hadn't occurred to me until fairly deep into drafting that I was sort of reflecting on the ways that, families are often bent around something that happened to one person in the family a very long time ago.
Mhm. And and you can certainly feel that in the first chapter that you read, and Eleanor's just sort of e emotion walking into the house, her just very, palpable fear of walking into her own family's home. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, definitely. We have a question here from Sims about the cover art. She loves it. Can you talk a little bit about, um, how the cover came to be?
Yeah. So my publisher picked out this artist, Corey Brickley, who's also, like a really fantastic like monster artist. And Corey spent um, like did several renditions of this, but like the one that really stood out to us, or the idea that stood out to us was this idea of like the portrait where part of the portrait is ripped away. And he did a variant where there was like a big strip ripped away, and that was like probably like the second top contender. Um, but like that a lot of people were really fascinated by this particular image where it's just like where part of her mouth is gone.
Mhm.
Um, And they kept telling me something about how there's like a fifth color in the book cover that makes it like a little bit holographic, which is I think part of why it's like so particularly striking in person. Um, I had very little to do with this, but I'm very excited and proud of what they came up with.
Yeah, it's gorgeous, definitely. So are you working on anything right now? What can
Yes.
we look forward to?
So hopefully in spring 2022, hopefully, fingers crossed, I'll have the first in a duology that's an urban fantasy set in like a slightly different Richmond, actually. Um, yeah, that's sort of about like being young and growing up queer in Richmond, but through the lens of fantasy. And I suppose, like the big overarching theme in that is the way that tropes and archetypes can become confining. Wow, that makes it sound really dry.
Not at
It's
all.
about it's about people who are fighting their destiny.
Okay. That's super exciting that it's set in Richmond too. I think that will definitely
Oh
appeal.
yeah.
Do you see, I kind of, as I got to the end of What Big Teeth, I kind of saw that maybe there could be an opening for this story to continue. Do you have any plans for that?
Um, I'm thinking about it. I feel I have some ideas and some images, but nothing's really coalesced yet. I'm hoping that it's not like another 10-year process where I doodle a drawing and then, it takes that long to come to fruition. But I really like this universe and I love these characters, and I'm very open to doing one if I can figure out what it's about.
Yeah, the characters, even though they have some definite flaws, they also have some very endearing qualities too. So I would love to read more about them as well.
Yeah, I mean, I want to know what happens to them. Someone sent me an email asking like what happens to X particular character, like are they okay? And I was like, I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't answer that for you.
People are
I'll
invested.
let you
They
know when
need to
I
know
know.
more.
I I was really moved by that. Like that's like the best kind of letter that I could get as an author is like, is this person okay? I have to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that so interesting that as the author, you're not sure. You're kind of almost living the story with them and waiting to see how it unfolds.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise it doesn't stay engaging for me. Like I've tried writing things where I've got the plot laid out, but if I don't have some kind of mystery waiting for me, I really struggle to write.
So are you somewhere in between? Is it a plotter or a pantser?
I feel like the first draft has to be like 90% pants. Like I might have a couple of sort of pivotal scenes. And then after that, like, I end up going back in with, like the can of spackle and like figuring out where things need to line up a little bit more closely, or even like taking it apart and putting it back together in a different shape. But with the first draft, I'm trying to like keep myself guessing as much as I can. Because I mean, this is something that I never really expected to be doing as a career. So it was always for me about like the enjoyment of making something up for fun for myself, telling myself a story.
Yeah. It's just interesting to hear about the process. And I mean, I think that's what we all only hope for is, we just want to do something that we love for a living and, as a career. So that's so exciting that you've accomplished that. All
Yeah,
right.
it's still a little shocking.
Well, here's to many more years of publishing stories and getting to live that dream. That's great. All right, I'm gonna open it up if anybody has some last minute questions. Barbara has asked, can we buy your book locally? So I know that Chop Suey has your book, is that right? Maybe some signed copies?
Yes, I think I signed the pre-orders, and I think they had a few extra copies. So if you're quick, you might get a signed one.
Great, great. So Chop Suey, and then we also have it available at the library. You can go to our website and place it on hold through our catalog. You know, either option. I encourage you to do one or both for sure. All right. Okay, I don't see any last minute questions here. Like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed it, Rose, and I hope that our conversation this evening has gotten some other readers really excited about it too. And that you all will go read it and then share it with others that you think might enjoy it as well. And Rose, are you on social media? Can people connect with you that way?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, and I think from Twitter you can probably find everything else. Should I like drop my Twitter handle or something?
No, but just,
Okay.
you know,
Yeah.
some people, if you want to, you can, but some people like to follow up. So that's a fun way to get to interact with our favorite authors.
hmm Yeah, on Twitter, I'm mostly tweeting about me and my friends' contest to determine the best bean right now. So that's occupying most of my Twitter time.
That's great. That can be interesting too. All right. Well, thank you again, Rose. We really appreciate you joining with us. We're excited to have such a wonderful local YA author in the Richmond area, and we'll look forward to more books to come in the future.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for everybody for coming out on a kind of dreary Wednesday. It's really nice.
Agreed for tuning in virtually. We really appreciate it. And if you want to join in on any of our other teen events, you can go to our library website at rvalibrary.org and check out what else we have going on. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Bye, everybody.